So, black families in Mississippi are recounting just how their farms were taken from them over generations following the freedom of slaves in the South. A new report in The Atlantic highlights just how the black population in Mississippi fought to secure farmland. And when they did, racist laws and white farm owners found ways to take that land away from them. Now, there are only a few black farmers left in the South, and their families are struggling to make ends meet. Vann Newkirk is the writer of that article, and he's a journalist with The Atlantic. Thank you so much for joining us, Vann. I think this is such a fascinating topic. When you think of some of the iconic images of America and Americana, that hardworking farmer who, breathes life into the land is often something that comes to mind. And often that image is of a white person and not of a black person. But in fact, there's a rich history of farming within the African American community that is evaporating. And I want to talk to you about that. That's what you sort of outline here. And you focus on the Scots. You tell their story. Give us sort of a brief synopsis, if you will, of what happened with the Scots and their land.
Okay, so the Scott family, they come over to Mississippi during Reconstruction. At the end of Reconstruction, Ed Scott Sr. comes over. He decides to make a name for himself, kind of. He comes out and starts farming land with the intent of eventually owning land. He's part of a generation of black folks who are intent on finding land to own. Eventually, through force of will, he's able to do that. He passes it on to his son, Ed Scott Jr., who manages the land through the middle of the 20th century and beyond. And Ed Scott Jr. and Sr., they never really take money from the federal government. They're able to be kind of self-sustaining for a while until Ed Scott Jr. runs up against the major farm inflation crisis in the 1970s and 80s. He needs a little bit of help. And the federal government is not willing to offer the help on the same terms they offer for white farmers. He gets into catfish. They don't fund him as much as they fund the other catfish farmers. He's still able to put together the country's first catfish plant owned and operated by black folks. He's this remarkable person who was at every step pretty much railroaded by the federal government funding, eventually has to close down and becomes a plaintiff in the 90s in the major black farmers lawsuit. His daughter and son helped shepherd the family through that lawsuit. They win back some of the land, but it's really, they're working the land right now. They have most of it back, and it's about 1,000 acres in Mississippi. Still, even with that, they struggle to this day to make it profitable farming, and it's an operation that, under any other circumstances, would be thriving today.
Many of the landowners featured in your piece played a role in the civil rights movement. Talk to me a little bit about the pressures from the impact that the movement had on farms, and why land ownership did not translate into power for these black farmers.
Right. So actually, the reason why they sought land ownership is because it was power. In a place where you could not vote, one way that black folks were able to exert power was through paying property taxes. Having some control over who was able to go where, having some control over the land under their feet. Like, the Klan couldn't come get you as easily if you had your own farm and had your own family members outside with shotguns on it. So it did give them some level of power, but the reason why it was so much of a focus of the civil rights movement in the South is because white folks understood that it gave them power. They understood that the people who were able to anchor the civil rights movement, to provide housing for the activists who came down, the folks who were doctors and teachers and lawyers who were funding it, they were all landowners. And white folks recognized pretty early on that one way to stop the civil rights movement, one way to undercut it, was to get rid of land ownership. And so if you were activists, an easy way that they could come and take and stop your activism was by threatening your federal farm money if you continued to join in the NAACP or protest segregation.
You also mentioned the Teachers Insurance and Annuity Association in your piece. Why does a pension firm control so much of the farmland, and what impact is that having?
Well, since the Great Recession, farmland has become pretty decently profitable for major investors like TIAA, like other pension funds, a lot of pension funds from even international places. Other like cities in Europe have lots of farmland in the South. It's basically two reasons. It wasn't profitable before, but after the Great Recession, the dollar weakened. And people started looking for assets that could diversify their portfolios in a new way. And one thing we are certain of is that the world's population will continue to increase. We will always need food. And investors are seeing now that arable land, that farmland, especially within the United States, is becoming more and more valuable and will only increase value over time. And where is a lot of that land concentrated? But the Mississippi Delta in the South, especially in places where it was taken from Black people.
You know, it's funny, often there are polls or sort of rankings for this country, the school system, healthcare, blah, blah, blah. Often Mississippi ranks close to the bottom in many of these polls. I wonder what you think Mississippi would look like if African American farmers had been allowed to keep their land and flourish.
One of the reasons why I worked on this piece and why I decided to do it in Mississippi is my family's from Mississippi. And every time people tell me about what it was like and what it could be, I am reminded that the reason why all these health metrics, all these education scores, all the other pieces of dysfunction that are mentioned with Mississippi's name, they come about exclusively because of policy, not because of any type of dysfunction that's inherent to the Black population there. They are in the counties where dispossession of the sort that I'm talking about in this article was the most extreme and intense. And I do think if it had not happened, if Black folks had been allowed to vote and to own land and to build the kind of collective farmland that Fannie Lou Hamer was talking about, we'd be seeing something that the world really has not seen. You'd be looking at Black people in control of their own destiny in the United States, a political powerhouse that would, just in that state, if they had two Black senators from most of our country's history, think about how that would change the politics of America. Those are things we cannot take lightly in thinking about what's been done.
Vann, I'm so glad you brought up that point. I think often, you know, you hear from critics who say, hey, my family came over with, you know, nothing and they were managed to sort of pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And that argument completely ignores the policies and the systematic attempts at taking wealth away from African Americans as at limiting their possibilities for growth. It's not the same fight. It's not the same battle. It's an uphill battle that is often not recognized when people say, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Vann, it's a great article. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.